Hey, welcome back to my series on learning Maya for beginners. Today, we're taking a second look at unfolding or unwrapping UVs. We already did this just with a completely basic cube for texturing something like a dice, but I wanted to show you kind of some different options you could use to approach this. So the method that we used for the dice was this UV 3D cut and sew tool. So essentially, if I were to assume this is just a soda can, I just got a super simple model. It's not that great. But let's just assume that you wanted to unfold this in a way that would be useful. You first want to go look at a reference and see, where does the actual label itself go to, and then what part is just the silver aluminum can. So I kind of determined that it was about this edge right here. Because I have, let's see, this one here. This is about where I'd want to cut this as a UV. So from below this point, I'd want the label to wrap around, and above this point would be the lip, just the aluminum can. And then somewhere, maybe down about here, one of these, I'd probably do the same thing. Maybe maybe this one. And this is why reference is useful. So the way that we would have approached this, if we used the UV 3D cut and sew tool, let me just switch back to object mode, is just slice that off, and then somewhere around the back here is where I would just go down this edge, like so. So now you see I kind of have these different shells that I can get to. So this one, now that we have it cut the way we want it to, we could just unfold this. You'll see this unfolds in a pretty nice way. And then you could just deal with those two pieces kind of separately. So we're going to go with a sort of a similar approach. I'm just going to reset this with a planar map just in case. But we want to look at this. If we weren't going to use that 3D cut and sew tool, there are other options available to us that I want to just show off what they actually can do. So in this case, we're mostly working with a cylinder, and you'll see under this Create menu, I'm in my workspace UV editing in the UV toolkit. You can also access a lot of this through this UV menu. But under Create, you'll see it has things like automatic, where it does its best to try to break things apart. Sometimes this can be useful as maybe a starting point, and then you can sew things back together. It usually breaks it into more pieces than I tend to want. And if I hold Shift and click on this, I can get the options. You'll see that I can adjust the number of planes it's projecting from. I can say I want fewer pieces or less distortion. So there are a number of things you can do to try to get this to work better for what you want it to be. But in the end, I don't know that this is as helpful. My suspicion is in the future, this will probably get better, and UV unfolding will probably just be easier and easier as time goes on, and we get more, algorithms that are doing the work for us essentially. But then we have this cylindrical. You'll see I have spherical, normal-based, planar, which is just from one plane. I use this one all the time, and I'll kind of show you an example today. Best plane, I also use a lot. Contour stretch. So you've got some pretty good options. And what you can do is just select the faces that you want to unwrap. So I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit here. Face mode. So if I were to just grab these faces, now, yep, I had a suspicion I probably got these as well. Okay, so I've selected the faces that I want, and now I can just, with those faces, do a cylindrical unwrapping. Now I'm going to hold Shift and click on this one as well. Sometimes I like to see if there's anything in particular that I want to look for as I'm doing a cylindrical map. Project. Now in this case, we're outside of my range, my kind of 1-to-1 UV box here. So just shrink this down, move this up, And now I want to deal with these other pieces. So I could do the same thing. I could just select these faces up here. Now, in this case, this is an example of where I could just do the planar map. So a planar, if I hold shift and click on this one, you'll see I have project from, and you can have the y-axis, the z, or the x. So I'm going to just leave it as y, and you'll see as I project this, it kind of just looks straight down at it. We get this little box. Now, when you see these boxes in any of these, and cylindrical had the same thing, you actually do have options to adjust these. So you can click on this, which will give you options for rotation or moving, scaling. You've got some default kind of scale things here. So especially with the cylindrical, I find myself switching that sometimes, whether it's rotating it to better match where my cylinder is in space. But kind of keep in mind that you do have those options. So this is just projected this completely flat. So I'm gonna kind of move this. I think I'm gonna take this shell just out of the way for a second. Now, of course, it's a good time to kind of check and see what my texel information is really doing, what these kind of, this grid to give you an idea of how your pixels are gonna position themselves. Now you'll see on the cylindrical part, I do have a little bit of stretching going on right here. So this might be something that I want to take a look at. Now I could just look at, the texture I'm going to wrap around this, the label, and if it's all going to be one solid color, that might not be a huge deal. However, if I know that somebody somewhere is going to be painting on this and there might be, spots of rust, you don't want to stretch out their rust. So you want to potentially kind of take the UV and try to fix that. So I'll show you kind of some tools you can use to fix things. Now this one, definitely we're going to get stretching on a lot of this, and we're getting kind of some weird angles on this part too. So this is where things can get a little bit tricky. So what I'm going to do for now, let's make sure I'm in my UV shell mode, is try out this optimize tool. So under unfold, I have this optimize. And what this will essentially do is it's going to try to flatten out anything that I've created. And the main reason this is important, if I go to face mode and try to look at this face, for example, zoom in a little bit, you'll see that that face is showing up just as a line over here. And what that essentially means is that it's going to stretch. If you put any pixel information right here, it's just going to stretch down the face, because it doesn't know what to do with those pixels. It can't display those pixels properly. Okay, so that's, and I'm already in my tools, so you can see what I'm doing here. Select this, optimize. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of paint around this, and you'll see that it just stretches it all out, flattens it all out, and I need to rescale this now to fit into my space. Okay, and now if you look, we are getting much better information. You can see that these are wrapping around. Now it's still not perfect. Some of them are kind of twisting or doing something a little unusual. So this is where the art, and kind of here we're getting some bow information. This is where the art of unwrapping UVs kind of takes a lot of practice. This is where you really have to figure out what the best approach to unwrap something is. Now, if I'm going to just texture this one solid color, if this is just going to be aluminum, then a little bit of distortion may not be a bad thing. And even if I'm going to paint things like rust or something on this, a little bit of distortion, once again, may not be a bad thing. And in some software like Substance Painter, you might be able to get around some of that, even if your UVs aren't completely perfect. So optimize tool, that's kind of the next thing that is worth looking at. And you'll see if I did run the optimize tool, even on this UV shell, it would kind of curve these, which would correct some of the distortion we saw here. The only potential problem here is now the seam might be a little bit tricky to work with. You just have to make sure that your texture is following this edge of the seam and not, I'm going to leave this just on a straight line, but it's just a matter, if you were in Photoshop, of making your picture, your image, match that. So kind of distort the same way that it is distorting, I guess you could say. So now, once I got this one laid out and fit into this space, the next step, of course, is to take your snapshot, and then you can bring it into, Photoshop like we did with the dice. Go find a label from, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, whatever, and just fit it inside this space, and then you could paint this kind of a silverish color if you wanted to go with aluminum, or add kind of a rust effect if you wanted to do that. And then you'll just bring it back in, attach it in Hypershade. So we already did that in a different video. You can look at that with the dice, so I'm not going to go over that again. But just a few other things that I wanted to show. The best plane is a good option if you have something that's curved. So if you had, I don't have a good example, but if this face was like at a slant, for example, then what you could do, I'm just going to get out of my tool here, select this UV shell, and do a best plane. So you can click on this, and then it says you have to select a face and then press enter. So I can select a face, press enter, and now it's going to project from kind of the direction of that face. Now this is essentially doing the same thing my planar had done, where it's just looking straight down at this. But like I said, if this had been at an angle or something like that, this could be a really good option. So I definitely use this one a fair amount. Spherical is great, of course, if you have spherical type objects. Some of the other things you want to look at are under tools. So I'm not going to go over all of these, but we kind of looked at like the cut and the sew, so that you could sew things back together, find edges, you could cut, and separate these into multiple shells. The optimize brush is even right here. So I would just look up a lot of what these can do, because some of these can do great things, so that you could, pin down part of this and only move around other parts of it. So UVs are kind of a patient, slower than you want them to be process. Best thing to do is just practice. Just find objects or model objects and then unfold them. I had a professor who said, unfold everything you ever make. If you model something, just immediately go unwrap that and try to get the most optimized UVs that you can pull off, just for the sake of practice. So that would be my advice too. There's definitely more, you can do in here. You've got more pinning options, and a lot of these tools are just repeated in different menus here. Alignment is really helpful for different things. Arrange and layout I use. So feel free to look at that stuff. But that's kind of the basics of UV unwrapping, and hopefully that helps. And I will see you next time.